Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Meanwhile Here on Earth. This program features in-depth conversations with the leading names in the subjects of UFOs, abductees, the paranormal, panel discussions, and the very best and brightest of the next generation of writers and researchers. Meanwhile Here on Earth, the show breaking new ground in alternative talk with your intrepid host, veteran investigative writer and researcher, Peter Robbins.
Thank you, Race Hobbs, for that introduction. This is Peter Robbins. The show is Meanwhile Here on Earth. And my special guest tonight is Tom DeFrancisco. And we're going to get to Tom very shortly. But I occasionally do a monologue before we open. And there is one that I am compelled to do for this show. Early this morning, early yesterday morning, a good friend and a very valuable member of the UFO research community, Earl Gray Anderson, passed away. He had been fighting cancer, had a heart attack, was on life support, and yesterday he had to be taken off. Earl was, among other things, MUFON State Director of Southern California, a STAR team member, an executive member of MUFON's Experiencer Research Team, and hosted MUFON's Experiencer workshops at the last 3 MUFON symposiums. He personally investigated more than 1,000 UFO reports and specialized in Experiencer abductee cases. He had appeared as a guest on many shows over the years, been a guest featured player on documentaries, and appeared on Ancient Aliens, among other shows. He was a very valuable speaker at conferences, a guitarist. We'll go with some pictures here. A son, a husband, here on his wedding day to his beloved wife, Lisa Johnson, a dad, a grandfather, a television personality and host, a very fine conference speaker, and a good friend and esteemed colleague of so many of us in the work. I last saw Earl in January when I was out in California to film an episode of Ancient Aliens, and we went out to dinner that night with our friends Whitley Strieber and Greg Bishop and a new friend of theirs, an old friend of mine, Robert Young, also my attorney, and took some pictures, this being the last of them. And if there's a last photo with a friend that's any better than this, you send it to me. We will miss Earl terribly, and our hearts go out to Lisa, to their 3 children, and to all of the many friends of Earl who are having a very rough day like me. Tonight's guest, who I've been looking forward to having on this show for several years, Tom DiFerdinando, is a pain, injury, and trauma therapist and a newly inaugurated director and president of the Orgone Biophysical Research Laboratory, or OBRL. For decades, Tom has studied and worked with the natural science and life energy discoveries of Dr. Wilhelm Reich, with a particular emphasis on Reich's biophysical and cosmological discoveries. Tom has also worked as an associate in the lab of the late scientist Dr. James DeMeo, who we'll be discussing at length in the second half of this show. And DeMeo was the director and the founder of the OBRL and author of many books and research papers on Wilhelm Reich and his discoveries. Reich's central discovery, was what he called the orgone energy, what the Hindus called the prana, what the Victorians called the ether, the energy, the sea of energy that exists around us. And the universal life energy force recognized by traditions throughout history, but not fully objectified in a laboratory until Reich himself achieved it in the 1940s and 50s. Dr. DeMeo replicated the vast majority of Reich's discoveries, meanwhile making remarkable discoveries of his own. Tom, over the years, had the opportunity to witness and participate in many of these replications and discoveries, and also used Reich's findings himself to develop an innovative, hands-on approach to therapeutic body work based upon the orgone biophysics of pain, injury, stress, and trauma. Most recently, Tom and the OBRL sponsored a UFO UAP conference in Ashland, Oregon, with the great Daniel Sheehan as the keynote speaker, where Danny spoke about his new Paradigm Institute and their efforts to promote and advance the UFO UAP disclosure project, where the U.S. government has finally acknowledged that this phenomena is real, that crashed extraterrestrial craft have been recovered, and that extraterrestrial beings that perished on those crafts have been recovered. We'll be talking about the remarkable and life-changing work, again, and legacies of both Dr. Wilhelm Reich and Dr. James DeMeo, to include some of our personal stories, experiences, and long-term interactions with Dr. DeMeo. Tom, welcome to Meanwhile Here on Earth. It's a pleasure to have you on this show.
Thank you, Peter. I'm thrilled to be here, and I've been looking forward to this for quite a while, and my condolences for your friend, too.
Thank you. And it's now a little over 2 years since we've lost Jim, isn't it?
Yeah, it's actually 3. Unbelievable. Wow. Yeah, it was. That was an awful time. And and it was. I only even went public with his death earlier this year.
Yeah.
Because of the potential threat to his work and his archives and everything, and because I lived 3,000 miles away from where all that was, there was a lot of busy work to try to get things into a safe place so that we could launch the new OBRL and lay to rest our dear James DeMeo.
Yeah, we both came to this work in very different ways, and I want to spend a good part of the first hour that we have here talking about Dr. Reich, his life and discoveries. But first, I'd like our viewers and listeners to have an idea of how you became the person you are and what first got you interested in the work. Can you tell us a little bit, Tom, about your childhood and growing up?
Oh, you're going way back.
Way back to the beginning.
I'm thinking, when did I find out about Reich? It's like, whoops, wait a minute, we're in the womb now. Oh my gosh, now I have to reframe my whole head. Childhood. Well,
I'm confident.
I'm not intimidated. Childhood. I guess actually one of the through lines just in my life is that and explains a lot of who I am today and what I'm doing today is that I was just an enormously creative kid. And also, I didn't know this at the time, but had a deep passion to try to understand nature and human beings. Now, I didn't have that language, of course, at the time, but when I think back to different questions I would always ask and interests that I had, I was really just trying to make sense of the world. And my now I have to say my foreground relative to that background, because the background I was going to start with was my background is actually acting, writing, and directing. And it's funny, in my classes, I used to get on my fellow students' nerves because I was just always asking questions. And it was like, Tom, you're in your head too much. You just stop asking. And I wanted to understand the craft of acting. I mean, to me, it's a real thing. It's not just magic. You don't just wing it. You're doing something. When you see great acting, somebody is doing something. What are they doing? I want to understand that. And it was terrible the way people would look at that as a nuisance. It's like, you don't want to understand your craft. So of course that's kind of a theme throughout my life and made me much of a loner. where I just to get rid of the static and to think and look clearly, I just had to like practically do everything myself. So so there was this incredible creative impulse, this desire to understand nature, and that was part of what I realized, part of what I'd gone into acting for, was to understand human beings, human nature. So while in the middle of that, because I had, I'm trying to think how to streamline this, but I want to hit some points because I know I've seen some of your shows, and I know you like this kind of stuff, and your audience, some of these details. I had my big crisis in my early 20s was, well, it was catalyzed by everybody saying, you think too much, you think too much, you think too much. So I tried to stop thinking. And you know what happens when you try to stop thinking? It makes you suicidal. It's like, you can't stop that any more than you can stop your basic needs or stop breathing or, but I had to realize that. I had to go through that dark place and had to go through this whole process of elimination where I basically just, again, in a nutshell, was like, I had to clean from my life everything I ever thought, everything I ever believed, everything I ever knew, anything that was important to me. It was like I had to clean the slate. And the result of that, because there were a couple of big breakthroughs here. The big breakthrough there was there were certain things I couldn't throw away, like my humanity. I came to realize, breathing, basic needs, perception, emotions, the capacity to move. These are a part of what define our humanity. So it gave me a new foundation for understanding myself and my relationship to other people and my relationship to nature. So with that background, there's one other snippet. Just before that humanity breakthrough, I had my own finding myself moment, which for me was a moment where after, I think I was writing in like a journal-like thing, just kind of a stream of consciousness. And partially under the influence of my acting background in working out a role, when you're trying to understand a character.
Yes.
I was going through this process and I realized all of a sudden it kind of, everything about my life came together in one sentence. And I realized what I was all about. And that sentence was to deepen my understanding of human nature and the creative process.
Wow.
And it was such a liberating moment. I remember being at the NYU dorm. I started jumping up and down. I was so thrilled. Something lifted. Even the dingy, ugly yellow dorm room looked good. Just my eyes opened up. Extraordinary. So anyway, so now I'm in this amazing place. My life completely changed. No more suicidal ideation. And now nothing was intimidating. Anything was just a challenge. And when I first heard about Reich's work and Reich, I'd heard his name like in acting classes and from some other people. But it was one day, a girlfriend I had at the time, she had this great big fat encyclopedia of philosophy. And I was into Einstein at the time. I felt I understood myself. I kind of understood people. Now I wanted to understand nature. So I thought Einstein was going to be the ticket, not realizing that was not the right ticket, but that was the path I went at that time. So it happened to be, I'm looking through this encyclopedia of philosophy because I want to look up something on relativity. And right in between religion and relativity is Reich. So I said, so here's this guy everybody's talking to me about. So I read these 5 or 6 paragraphs. I forgot who the author was. He's a known guy. And I said, oh my God, this guy is right in line with everything I'm finding out for myself, except that he has the science to it. So first thing was I went out to the NYU library. I was already out of college, but I still had access to the library. Got a copy of Function of the Orgasm, just shot through it. Oh my God, oh my God, oh my God. And then I'll just say one more thing. Then I think it was like 3 days later, I'd gone to Barnes & Noble because at the time they had all of Reich's books and some books about him. Yeah. And I stood and everything was like on this one shelf. And I mean this literally. I stood there probably for 3 or 4 hours and I took each book and went all the way through. Oh my God, the psychology. Oh my God, function of the orgasm. Oh my God, sociology. Oh my God, the biomes. Oh my God, cancer. Oh my God, physics. Oh my God, the atmosphere. Oh my God. And just was ready for the whole package. So I got all of Wilhelm Reich in about 3 or 4 hours and haven't turned back.
What an introduction.
You asked.
Reich's life, I'm kind of amazed that, it's a double-edged sword, but I'm kind of amazed that nobody's ever attempted to make a big feature Hollywood movie. It has so much drama that simply was a part of his life and work that I guess most people wouldn't believe it. But I'm going to try to give a capsule history here. It will be just that. We could do this show for a year and still have material to cover from his vast discoveries and extraordinarily prolific writing. Reich was born in 1897 into a privileged family in the old Austro-Hungarian Empire. His mother, a very sensitive soul and a piano teacher. His father, a very Prussian bureaucrat, somewhat distant emotionally. Reich and his brother Robert were privately tutored, and by the time he was of age, World War I was declared, and the empire went to war. In 1918, the war was over. Reich, having served with distinction as an artillery officer, returned home to find out he had no home and no country and no empire. He had expressed a desire to study medicine, and growing up on this estate, had an opportunity to observe, as any farm kid would, natural functioning among animals, sexual, life and death, and was kind of a human sponge at that point in terms of taking things in. Although he did not have the money to go to school, he made his way to Vienna and enrolled in medical school. He supported himself by being a tutor to other students, and his drive was really to complete medical school and meet really the man of the time in terms of the most discussed and the most influence in the Western world of this new science of psychiatry, and that, of course, was Dr. Sigmund Freud. Reich presented, Freud recognized his brilliance, and he became part of the inner circle. Oh, sorry, that's the First World War picture there. The inner circle of the first really generation of psychotherapists practicing in the Freudian manner. Reich and Freud split in 1928. What happened really at that point was, after 6 or so years of work in the Freudian method, Reich observed to Freud that while Freud felt many, if not most, human neuroses were rooted in sexual pathology or dysfunctioning, Reich felt that literally all of them were. And this was a bit much for Freud, still very much a Victorian in many respects, and his very proper inner circle, and Reich left. This began really the first wave of legends that Reich was insane. For the Freudians, the proof of his insanity was that he left working with Freud, and that, of course, would prove that you're crazy, right? He was very interested in the potential of socialism, and still very much under the sway, as many idealists were, of the possibilities that the Soviets were offering at their request. And with great enthusiasm, he set up a series of clinics to work with workers. They were called sex pol clinics, sex and politics, and made it their business to try to resolve these problems among working couples, most of them factory workers or military or the like. Much to the disappointment and ultimately horror of the communists, if people within this therapeutic model that Reich had established were able to establish for themselves what Reich termed a meaningful sexual equilibrium, i.e., a happy, healthy sex life, horror of horrors, their first interests were no no longer in their production quotas at the factory, but in their love for each other and raising a healthy family. He was expelled from communism and understood that it was a pathology unto itself, and was an avid anti-communist for the rest of his life. By 1933, Hitler had consolidated power, and a young Reich, who was distinguishing himself, again, as a young therapist here and at work on his first book, The Character Analysis, escaped from Austria to Germany. And as the borders were closing, I think possibly on the day or within a few days of the German border closing, was able to get out and make his way to Norway. In Norway, he continued his work and broadened it, also to work on a series of experiments known as the Bion experiments, which we'll go into in a bit, and work on a cancer therapy. But even the open-minded Norwegians were somewhat skeptical of this renegade doctor and wondered what he was all about. Here he is in a photo with with Ola Rackmes in the background there. Rackmes was the only person that I'm aware of in Reich's entire life of training physicians and psychologists to be medical ergonomists, who was neither. He was a layman, but very skilled, very knowledgeable, and very much in contact with the realities of Reich's work and philosophy. In 1939, he was invited to emigrate to the United States and take up a teaching post at the New School for Social Research in New York City, which he did. He established a practice in Queens, New York, and by the early 50s, had purchased a property in southern Maine, in a town called Rangeley, and built a structure there that is really one of the most marvelous buildings in terms of practicality I've ever visited. I don't know about your first impressions of visiting Organon, Tom, but for me, being in a building where the living area, without you even realizing it, flows into a laboratory, flows into a library, a painting studio, an observatory, patients' rooms. It's one of the most functional buildings I've ever been in my life. And it's built with all the old flagstone of the old farmhouse that it replaced. It is now, by the way, the home of the Wilhelm Reich Museum, and is a must visit if you're ever in southern Maine and they are open that day. This is on the top floor, a photograph of his painting studio. And as a painter, I found this just one of the most joyous places to be. It was at about this time, really earlier, that Reich had developed what we call the Orgone Energy Accumulator, or ORAC, because this very simple device made of layers of organic and inorganic material, because it's so incredibly simple, it was immediately deemed a bit of quackery because nothing plugged into anything. It obviously was nonsense because, well, what else is it going to be? And you and I know from experience and from years of study that organic material holds energy. Inorganic material reflects it. And with the inner layer being metal and every concentric layer being, it could be humusite or plywood or any organic material. The inorganic material could be steel wool or window screening. It produces a concentrated energetic effect on humans and materials. A small one can be used for seed germination. And it was also the basis of one of his most profoundly important experiments. And Tom, I'm going to ask you to jump in here and talk about TO minus T, the experiment illustrated in this schematic, if you would.
Sure. So the accumulator, like Peter said, you have these alternating layers of organic and inorganic, and for the scientists in the group, the organic matter are those with what's called a high dielectric. It's almost like they hold in conventional physics, a high static charge. And then the metals that are most effective are ferromagnetic. You know what I mean? They're iron based, and you can stick a magnet to them. And the structure of the accumulator is similar to what Dr. DeMeo would call a hollow capacitor. Very similar to a capacitor, but not. So simply by layering it this way, you get a net effect of energy being reflected toward the inside, because the inner walls are the metal and the outer walls are the celotex. So you have an absorbing and reflecting, absorbing, reflecting, absorbing, reflecting, with a net effect of more energy concentrated in the middle, where when you do scientific measurements, there are all kinds of anomalies. And the big one, which you're pointing out, the TO minus T, is that you get a slight temperature difference on the inside of the accumulator than the control.
Yes.
Now this is, you go through very detailed, this is not actually an easy experiment to do. And Dr. DeMeo spent like 5 years putting together what he would call a bulletproof one, where any conventional physics could not argue against the effect. And I witnessed all this and participated in its evolution. And sure enough, on the best days, which are the drier days, because this energy is drawn to water, so the higher the humidity, the less effect. The drier the air, the more strong the effect. And sure enough, after you thermally match the accumulator and the control, right? Because there's a thermal lag. You know, thicker materials, it takes longer for the temperature to equalize with the environment. So you got to rule all that out scientifically so that they're matched thermally, is the language. And even with that thermal matching, the accumulator maintains a temperature above that of the control. Now, anybody who knows the second law of thermodynamics would predict, at least for closed systems, people leave that detail out, but within closed systems, temperatures, you mix hot and cold water, it becomes warm. It doesn't stay hot and cold next to each other, right?
Yes.
Although that's what biological systems do, and that's what the orgone accumulator does. It maintains an energy level measured through temperature a little bit higher than the background environment, which goes against conventional physics.
Yeah. The accumulator also works on the basis of what Reich termed the orgonomic potential. That is, unlike the conventional energy systems we are accustomed to thinking in terms of, in which the energetic potential moves from the stronger system, which is the source, to the weaker, orgone energy flows from the weaker system to the stronger. A very important point in Reich's work, development, and life as a scientist was that in late December of 1940, he sent a carefully worded letter about his work to Dr. Albert Einstein in Princeton. The letter, written in German, said in part, quote, "Several years ago, I discovered a specific biological energy which in many ways behaves differently from anything that is known about." Einstein responded by letter 6 days later, apparently intrigued enough to invite Reich to Princeton. And that meeting was arranged for January 13th of 1941. That afternoon, both men spent more than 4 hours reviewing some of his experimental work. He brought equipment with him to set up and demonstrate for Dr. Einstein. Einstein observed the glowing energy for himself, that we'll be looking at a picture of later. And I forget the exact quote, but that if this is true, it will be a bomb in physics. In other words, it will completely disrupt everything that we think we know. Einstein seemed to be unwilling to observe what he, to acknowledge what he was observing with his own eyes, and asked if Reich would leave the equipment there so that he could replicate some of the work on his own, which he did, and ultimately confirmed and reconfirmed Reich's findings, but ultimately dismissed the results with an unfounded rationale. Very much stung, Reich wrote back to Eisenhower, imploring him to reconduct the experiment, but he never did. Letters between their assistants followed for a number of years, comes to almost 100 pages of writing in German and English for anyone interested in really studying this extraordinary chapter in the unknown world of scientific development in the 20th century, can purchase the full proceedings from the bookstore at the Wilhelm Reich Museum. In Rangeley, Reich first began to observe the UFO phenomena, which he went on to document in depth, make certain conclusions about, and ultimately publish around. Also at this time, an experiment called the Orinor experiment was conducted at the estate. And it was a chilling example of the accumulator's undeniable ability to concentrate energy. It called for the placing of a very small amount of radium into an orgone energy accumulator. And the results were so overwhelming that it toxified a surprisingly large area in and around Reich's home. And it took months for the atmosphere really to return to normal. Tom, do you want to make any comments on the Orinor experiment?
Yeah. First, is it okay to jump back to the accumulator?
Absolutely.
So just to give people some context to keep it simple, because this stuff is like so kind of amazing and mind-boggling. Where do you put it? So the thing with Einstein and Reich is that if you realize Einstein's work was all based, what we were talking about, the second law of thermodynamics, and you talked about Reich's work and the orgonomic potential. Understand that these are two directions of energy movement, one from mechanical dead systems, whereas Reich is dealing with living organisms. Yes. It's a life energy. So you realize those are the two big categories you're talking about. One, energy runs downward from higher potential to lower. It runs out, whereas organisms, pull energy from the environment and develop.
Yeah.
So people who are obsessed with the second law of thermodynamics, they try to use that to explain growth and development. And you have to tie yourself into a pretzel to make sense of it, instead of just acknowledging, wait a minute, there's an energy that moves in the direction of development. It's not just toward death, it's toward integration, not just disintegration. So just to kind of, so that whole world is what Reich was discovering. And like I said, my interest in Einstein early, the reason, of course, it fizzled out, because Einstein's work is all about death. He took the life energy out of the universe and said, they calling it the ether at the time, they said the ether is unnecessary. Space is empty. Yeah. And that was a catastrophic move for physics, as when we get to Dr. DeMeo, I can talk about that more.
Yeah.
But the Orinor, a remarkable discovery, because there too, you start to understand a whole new world for healing even. This idea of people call it hormesis, where you use a little bit of a nuclear material that in higher quantities is highly toxic, using tiny amounts just to excite the organism into healing. It kind of started the beginning of that. He didn't live long enough to really develop that, but he laid out the foundation. For one of the 100 things that he laid foundations for that he just didn't have time to develop. And that's one of them, the whole idea of what he called Orinor medicine. That's just a side point.
I guess the next major development in Reich's work as a scientist was that of the cloudbuster. I first want to show a photo of a vacuum tube that is energetically excited and showing the actual blue of the energy that Reich observed, and again Einstein observed with Reich. I guess next to the accumulator, the apparatus that Reich developed that has come to have so much romantic notions attached to it, been misused extraordinarily, has the potential to green the entire Earth, but under circumstances that I don't know if humanity will ever meet. The cloudbuster is made up of a series of long metal pipes grounded in deep or running water by attached lengths of hollow industrial BX cable. When properly employed, it is capable of altering weather patterns in the surrounding atmosphere. The principle it operates under is deceptively simple. The elevated pipes create atmospheric movement by drawing down atmospheric energy and harmlessly grounding it in a well, a pond, or a river. This movement is, again, by the waters, the cables being submerged in the water. This movement is capable of breaking up a stagnant weather front by attracting moisture-rich air into the area and to the locations in the route of the direction from which you are drawing from. The Cloudbuster also interacted in ways that one cannot deny because of the number of witnesses over the years with UFO activity. When he aimed this apparatus at UFOs, first over Maine and then over UFO activity outside of Tucson, where perhaps the most important weather experiment of the century was conducted in 1956. Reich traveled with a number of colleagues across the United States with two Cloudbusters, trailer mounted, in tow, and set up for business on a leased piece of land just outside of Tucson. This is a note from Reich's journal on two of the UFOs, which he called EAs, that he was observing. This is one of the Cloudbusters on its way out to Arizona. While in Arizona conducting the most extraordinarily successful weather operations that anyone could imagine, Reich was called to account for a breaking of an agreement, namely that orgone energy accumulators, which were being manufactured on order by physicians for potential patients in Maine, shipped the components for an orgone energy accumulator across state lines in violation of a ruling that the FDA had pushed through, FDA, Federal Drug Administration, who at the time was very suspect of Reich as some kind of sex quack. All they knew was that human sexuality entered into his work and he was probably some kind of pervert. Reich, although he in no way was responsible for this shipment, decided to take personal responsibility for it, and in doing so made the very poor decision to try to represent the authenticity of his science in that court hearing, which he was not allowed to do. Ultimately was convicted on a charge that a minor, I'm trying to remember what the charge was, Tom.
He broke the injunction. There was an injunction about moving the accumulator over state lines, yeah.
And he was tried. There's a backstory here of how both of his attorneys had turned state's evidence behind him, absolutely reprehensible behavior. He was given a year sentence in Lewisburg Federal Penitentiary in Pennsylvania. Efforts were made to call the government to overrule this, but they did not. This pamphlet was the product of a great woman named Lois Weibel, who was a close associate of Reich's and also the editor, the first editor and longtime editor of the Journal of Orgonomy. Less than a week before his scheduled release on parole, he was found dead in his cell. Any conspiratorial-minded person can deduce, understandably, that there were circumstances that were dark surrounding his death. I hate to disappoint them, but Reich's heart was broken when he was forced into a room made of stone and metal a man whose life had totally been devoted to human freedom and to freeing up the human character structure. He was a chain smoker, a type A personality, ate a heavy diet, and I'm perfectly at peace with the possibility that he died a natural, if unnaturally sad death in that prison. Contact with Space, the book that delineates and discusses all of his work around his discoveries about UFOs, was published posthumously a month after he died. And his books, I don't know, maybe there are now close to 30 of them, Tom. There have been a number published, of course, since he passed away. Each one of them is absolutely shattering as far as their thinking, their courage, their observations on the misery of the human condition, again, courage to go after issues that were considered not polite to discuss in public. I have read, and now I'm rereading, many of them over these years, and if anything, they hit even harder now than they did when I first read them. These are just a handful of the titles. And in 1956, I guess, at a point, no, it was even earlier, under the Eisenhower administration, under the influence at that point of the Federal Drug Administration, federal agents started showing up on his property. And because Orgone Energy had been declared quackery, any book jacket of an original first edition in storage on the property that had no mention of Orgone Energy, but did mention it in passing on the flyleaf, mentioning another, were confiscated and taken to New York City government incinerators and burned between, I guess, about 55 or 56 and a few months before Kennedy's assassination, inauguration in 1961, more than 8 tons of original literature, hardcover books, scientific journals, weather modification journals were burned. A dark moment in American history. Wilhelm Reich is buried in a tomb on the property in Organon, looking over the beautiful lake. A photo of him with his young son, Peter, in 1944. And there are so many books about Reich that are really specious, vicious, uninformed, and quite murderous. Almost all of them written by individuals with little knowledge, if any, or experience in Reich's work or having read any of it, because why bother? We all know he was crazy. If you're looking to learn more about Wilhelm Reich's life, the definitive biography by the late Dr. Myron Sharoff, Fury on Earth, is the go-to book. Sharoff was a student and a patient of Reich's and worked with him in his laboratory in Maine, a good man who we lost years ago. And again, this has been only the most capsule description of the life and work of this millennially brilliant scientist, social observer, and I'm not even sure how to sum it up, Tom. I know for myself, having come upon Reich's work for the first time through the recommendation of my freshman college roommate, David Zaslow, who you know, now also a longtime resident and beloved rabbi in Ashland, Oregon. He loaned me a book called Character Analysis. And that was it for me. I realized I was in the presence of a truly great mind that I was not fully equipped to completely grasp. And over the next 10 years, at a modified pace, I read everything I could about him, and read his books, and ultimately went into therapy with Dr. Ellsworth F. Baker, who had been Reich's first assistant for the last 11 years of his life. That therapy was maybe the greatest gift I ever gave myself. And it also had the wonderful byproduct of allowing me to meet and spend time with a good number of individuals, really all gone now, who worked with Reich, worked under him, knew him in one way or another. Certainly there is no body of philosophy or scientific investigation that has had more of an impact on me in my work and my everyday life than the work of Dr. Wilhelm Reich.
Yeah. I want to say a couple things. One, early on, you mentioned, how's it, Hollywood hasn't been interested in making a movie. Actually, of course, Kevin Hinchey did make an excellent
sure, yeah,
that people can find online. But the bigger point in terms of the Hollywood movie, the real theme, the classic theme in movies, of course, is really like good and evil. I mean, that's like the most common, other than boy meets girl. There's good and evil, and that may be good and evil. But Reich is like, I put this in I reviewed one of Dr. DeMeo's books called In Defense of Wilhelm Reich on Amazon, and I wrote this very thorough review. And the point I was hitting at is, and this is what I think you're trying to get at with the difficulty in finding the right words. He's like the ultimate story of good and evil, because his whole thrust was to really understand the capacity to love, unlike anybody in history has understood. Understanding it in a natural scientific way, and not dead science, again, like mechanical science, but the real life, what real love and emotion, that fluidity, that spontaneity, and the way that it's actually an organized force. It's not chaotic, it's very lawful, but it doesn't follow conventional laws. It's biological laws. So here's a man who's diving as deep as possible into understanding the nature of love generally, and its relationship to love and to sexuality and work in particular. And then the forces that came after him were like the ultimate in evil, just having to do everything they can to cut the guts out of this man's discoveries, and cut the guts out of him, and cut the guts out of even a lot of the people who are proponents of his work. Cut the guts out.
It's intolerable. It has to be destroyed.
It just touches the depths. It's like there's nothing beyond those depths. I mean, he really touched it with his core understandings.
Yes.
And of course, naturally, it touched the deepest fears in certain people, and you get these expressions of evil. So his Reich's story is like the ultimate, Hollywood good and evil story, except it's not a story, and it's not fiction.
Yeah,
he lived it. And one other thought on that, I've noticed, this is something that somebody ought to do some scholarship on one day. Reich's work has found its way into the popular culture in a lot of ways that aren't recognized. The whole even something like the Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde. I mean, that doesn't come from Reich, but Reich, the way he was persecuted, he kind of gave life to that paradigm in society, and everybody identifies with that whole theme because of their own armoring, which we haven't talked about armoring. Your own energy blockage in your organism that creates what's recognized as neurosis. I just lost my train of thought there. Identifying that story makes sense to us because we feel the two halves in our own armored organisms. So you have something like and then you have the paradigm of the mad scientist. Okay, that part of that came from Reich in the 20th century. He was like the ultimate, looked at as the mad scientist. Even the stuff with the rainmaking. I wonder if that Hollywood movie I'm forgetting the actor's name, but it was not Charlton Heston, somebody else. They did this Rainmaker movie. How much of that was mythos, from Reich? You find there's like a dozen different things you can examine where Reich is actually in the culture but divorced from Reich. Very fascinating.
It is, and again, that mad scientist model a foreigner. They usually speak with an accent. They talk about things that you don't understand that make you feel either they're showing off or you're insecure about what you don't know.
And he talks about sex.
And when we talk about the armoring, we're not talking allegorically. What Reich observed was that as life deals its blows, especially ones that are particularly tragic or meaningful for us, the organism contracts. And in a normal, healthy organism, as time moves on, the contraction lessens itself and it expands and contracts. But contractions can become chronic. And within the body, that may mean that you're breathing more shallowly. There are bands of musculature that are tightening and becoming chronic because you're simply giving into them. The resignation, a terrible word in the English language, in a way, when we apply it to this, of just who's ever really happy? You know, why should I even aspire to it when I know I'm just going to get knocked down? We're all going to die anyway. Whoever really has a really happy sex life, and convincing ourselves into this sad oblivion that has condemned so much of the human race, really from the start. I sometimes wonder, in the world of what ifs, if the great religions of the world and Judeo-Christian philosophies, Islam certainly, had not done such a good job preparing their followers for sadness, pain, and terror. No great religion teaches about the dynamics of deep pleasure. It's literally always wired up with immoral behavior, being tested by the devil and God. If you allow yourself to feel too much pleasure, you'll become a dilettante or corrupt or clay in the hands of evil forces. When you know that connection with happiness and deep satisfaction is the drive mechanism in a healthy life. Reich philosophized that a healthy society, he called it a work democratic society, where the beginning components are that you have a bunch of people who are functioning well, who like being who they are, who are happy with their partners, are take pride in being part of a community, and choose to do something that they're passionate about and ultimately do well, that's of value to the community. Imagine living in a community like that. It seems an impossibility in the highly neuroticized world that we live in. But it is a model. And in smaller groups and in relationships themselves, it's a very real dynamic, even if a rare one on the world scene.
I think that was part of my attraction to Reich also, is because what you're hitting on is the question of what is natural. So what he was calling work democracy was basically, it wasn't an invention or a concept or a theoretical construct.
There was nothing mechanical about it.
Not at all. He said when society is working, whatever that working is, we don't understand it yet, but obviously there's a time when things work.
Yeah.
That he was identifying as work democracy, and then tried to suss out more what are the actual dynamics of it and their relationship to a lack of chronic armoring. Just say a couple things about the armoring too for the audience. The armoring process, what Peter was talking about, this contraction, basically its function is, well, it's to bind energy. You know, when you have repressed emotional energy generally and sexual energy in particular, you know, it gets bound up. And what happens is the functional unity is the term that Reich used. The functional unity of the organism becomes fragmented. So then now you're operating in parts that don't connect with reference to the whole. They connect kind of on their own, so that things become confusing, disjointed, there's contradictions. And fundamentally, the big thing that happens is a split. We see throughout the universe, there's unity and there's duality, right? Well, with the armoring, everything becomes a duality. You know, mind and body become irreconcilable. They're just two phenomena, you know, or structure and motion, the whole and the part. All these things are separated, whereas in fact, in nature, they're fully integrated all the time, you know. But with armoring, it doesn't make, it doesn't, you can't feel your way to that integrity. Once you take the energy out of the equation, and you take the energy out of the equation, you're attracted to the idea of taking the energy out of the equation because you can't feel it in your own body. And in fact, when somebody says or does something that triggers it, it becomes a threat.
Yes.
And that's where Reich actually, not only did he define love, he defined evil in the form of what he called the emotional plague, which is the reaction of us armored organisms not being able to tolerate the excitation against our armor. And so we have to kill the messenger.
That's perfectly stated. Another way of looking at it is my perceiving your good health. You're obviously being a well-balanced person who loves living, who loves and is loved, are intolerable to me because they remind me of everything I am not and that I don't have. And I need to get rid of you or discredit you to help me stay bound together because, well, I think we'll close this hour with the note that all of us were brought up to understand the basics of human sexuality as having two roots, procreation and pleasure. In fact, one of Reich's major discoveries, and something that if applied worldwide would change the world, is that there's actually a third equally important function, which is energy equilibrium. And without that ability, like think of an allegory for me is an old radiator in a New York City tenement in the winter. It's blowing off steam at an incredible rate at certain times and very quiet at other times. It's doing what it needs to do or the boiler will explode. And unfortunately, we live in a world of exploded boilers and of unhappy people and unsatisfied ones who are horrified by this information because, again, it's a reminder of that giant hole in the middle of their lives. Tom and I are going to take a 2 to 2.5 minute break right now. Stick with us. We don't have commercials to fill in, so do not become confused or disoriented when you see our backgrounds, but not us. We will be right back.
Thank you, Peter. Peter, you might want Peter, mute yourself.
And we are back. Can you hear me, Tom?
Yes, I can. You hear me?
I can. We can proceed.
Excellent.
The experience of being in medical orgone therapy for me was life-changing, and I had an opportunity to see myself in a way that I never had. At one point, I had what we call a breakthrough in therapy. This was some years into it, where a relationship that had ended had me very sad. And in the course of a session that followed, the breakup, the session with Dr. Baker, I guess a contraction around it was loosened. And I experienced something I'd never experienced before or since, which was literally the entire series of memories of that relationship in high speed within the course of a minute or so, 2 years, shooting by as though it were, a film trip, speeded up, and understanding in a way that I never had, literally in my body, what had happened. It was really out of my experience. Other things where I learned very effectively that behind sadness, frustration, often is a great deal of anger, and that becoming aware of that and channeling it can be far more productive than being sad. Given the choice, I would always choose rage over depression.
Right.
And I think looking back now at this point and thinking about first getting my hands on Contact with Space, which is probably the worst first book to read by Dr. Wilhelm Reich, of character analysis, I can see, like a gun sight, my life connected up along a series of synapses. And I sometimes am in wonder about the fact that the science that Reich called orgonomy, which is simply the science of how energy functions in the living and the non-living world, traverses what seems to be so many dissonant and unrelated areas of study, everything from meteorology to child raising, to cancer formation, to how universes form, to the way that an amoeba splits, to the way a star collapses. It all functions under a simple formula. Tension, as in electrical tension, a charge, as in building an electrical charge, discharge, and relaxation. For me, one of the great analogies of it is most of us are lucky enough to remember a really good thunderstorm. When it starts to come up, the sky darkens, the air gets still, the leaves on certain trees simply turn upside down. The air starts to fill, it starts to rain, and these discharges of energy, thunder and lightning, continue until they don't have to anymore. And it's spent. And the storm passes, and the air is sweet, and life goes on. The exact same formula, tension, charge, discharge, relaxation. When fully completed, it's exactly what happens when an amoeba splits, or two people come together at the same time, or how a high pressure and low pressure system come together to form a weather storm, or how a galaxy forms.
Yeah.
I found that absolutely inspiring. And it stays kind of in my loop of thoughts, depending on what's going on with me, for all these years, as just a constant that's in the background day to day. Tom, As we move into our second hour, I'm going to ask you, first, coming from your discovery of and your interest, and you're starting to study the life and work of Wilhelm Reich, how did you hear of at first, then meet Dr. James DeMeo?
The hearing about him and meeting him is actually a kind of a mundane story. Ironically, that same girlfriend that I referenced earlier, because she saw I started getting this sudden interest in Wilhelm Reich, she happened to see in New York City a place called the Open Center, which you know about.
Sure, I've spoken there.
Yeah, she saw that there was this guy, James DeMeo, was going to be doing this weekend workshop on Wilhelm Reich, and I can't remember if in there or somewhere else it also mentioned this discovery of this thing called Saharasia, and I was excited about it, because I didn't have really any other contact. I think I went to one American College of Ergonomy workshop at one point. Yeah, amazing book, which we'll talk about shortly.
Oh, you bet.
Yeah. So and in fact that they didn't have enough people signing up for it, and they canceled it. So I called up. I said, "This is too good. Don't cancel this." And they said, "Well, we've had a few other calls. Maybe we'll do it again." And they actually did it, put it up again. So I went there, and that was where I met him. It's actually where I met you, although we didn't have any conversations. We were in the same room.
Yeah.
So yeah. So and then over the years, I had some contact with him because he was, he sold hard to get books at the time, and was obviously doing this incredibly inspiring work, including like the book that you just held up. And it was finally in I think it was in around let's see, that was around 1989, I think. And then in 1998 or something, or 99, he was doing some research on Dayton Miller and the ether question at Case University in Ohio, and was going to be making a stop in New York. And now I was working with a whole other discussion. I was working with this AIDS dissident group in New York City that I was the executive director of. And I was integrating, I was working to bring the sociological insights of Wilhelm Reich and armoring into an understanding of this phenomenon called AIDS that seemed to be basically a marketing device with incredible distortion of information, and almost like there was some sort of social engineering going on. Anyway, it was just such a bad situation. I was bringing in some of Reich's work, and was so moved deeply by Jim's discovery of the origins of armoring. That's what the Saharasia is about. And so I called him up and I said, I'd like to organize a conference around you since you're going to be in New York. And I was going to kind of integrate some of this AIDS stuff with this. And I actually did two conferences with him. I think one was in 1990. Actually, I think it was 1999, and one was 2001. And he stayed with me in the apartment I was in at the time in the Bronx. And he and his wife stayed with me. And from there, we just became very close friends. And I think the next year after that first, I think it was in 2000, I was the first time I went out to the Oregon Biophysical Research Lab out in Oregon, up in the mountains there, and did his yearly workshop. Never thought I'd be able to go there, but he let me be an assistant, and so that I could reduce my costs.
Yeah.
And then I went out every year since then, up until he died. I went out for about a month every summer, and worked with him, assisted, talked with him, hung out with him, and it was really quite spectacular. It was wonderful because we thought pretty much alike, on all levels, and we're also both creative thinkers, and we're able to not get locked into the box, and,
yes.
and a deep appreciation for life energy phenomenon. Yeah. He was a geographer, so he was more interested in the geography of the planet and outer space, where I was interested in the geography of the body. We were interested in both,
yes,
but we had these emphases. So that was kind of that's kind of a nutshell version of how that came about.
Do you know when Jim acquired the property in the mountains outside of Ashland that became the Oregon Biophysical Research Laboratory?
Yeah, that was the OBRL. I think technically started in 1978 and was a traveling show. He had this bus,
right?
And he would have all his lab equipment, and he would go to different places because he'd been kicked out of university. So he had his university bus, and the whole reason he started the bookstore was he had this concept, which I'm taking further,
good,
of the university outside of the university. And universities have bookstores, right? So he had the bookstore of all the books that you would really want to understand orgonomy and
Yes.
life energy science. So he's traveling around the bus, and it was in 1994, he and his wife at the time, Terry Cook, acquired that property, and within a year had built the basic structure of the lab. And then each year, because James was a very expansive individual, each year I would go out there. I think he had a little pride in being able to surprise me each year with a new development. There was a new students' quarters. There was a new observatory. There was a new solarium. There was a new part to the building.
Let's take a look at the building itself, which also
that's an earlier version.
Yeah, a very different structure than Reich structured Organon, but also a wonderfully integrated structure in terms of laboratory work, residence, etc.
Yeah, the house. Yeah, and that's the back of the lab. That's the front when you drive up the driveway. That's the side of it. It's all right now. It's all that color of that shed off to the right. The whole thing. And there's also a whole solarium in that view you're showing here. There's a whole solarium in the front with plants and stuff to collect heat and also to help heat the place. And there's the observatory in the top right. People can see that. There's another view of it, and that's the cabin, the house in the back.
Oh, sure, of course,
And this is everything that I'm responsible for, and it breaks my heart. But I can't move there, so I'm gonna end up having to sell the place, which is heartbreaking. But it is. There's a lot of potential to the place. If anybody is interested in ergonomic research or starting a new school or setting up an Airbnb, anyway, there's a lot of possibility there, so you can contact me.
And for any viewers or listeners who might be interested in this seriously, please contact me, and I will put you directly in touch with Tom or contact him directly. It is a remarkable facility, and here's another aspect of it.
This is the orgone room. This is an accumulator size room. You can see on the inside of the door there on the left and the right, you see portions of the orgone accumulator cabinets right there, and which people are large enough for people to sit in.
Yeah.
These I might as well, because people talk about books. I would mention, if you want if you're interested in the accumulator stuff and the basic science in that and want to build one yourself, which I strongly encourage. Yes, there you go. You got the Orgone Accumulator Handbook. Voila. Good move, Peter.
There's nothing that comes close to it if you're serious about wanting to build an accumulator. That's simple.
Yeah, very, very thorough. Gives lots of history. One of my favorite chapters in there is called, God, now I'm forgetting the wording, but I think it's called An Unusual Energy Discovered by Other Scientists. Because James he was great with detail, incredible with detail, but he was also great with the global view. And so he would always bring in these other researchers, Giorgio Picardi, Louis Curvan, and Brown. I'm forgetting his name. All these people that would Sheldrake. You go down the list. There's like 20 of them who keep bumping into life energy phenomena, and they may not call it that. I mean, some were brave enough. Halton Arp, another one. But there's this other something going on in nature. And, we have all these, science has these kind of like bookkeeping devices, whether it's the neutrino sea or, the dark matter. These are basically bookkeeping devices for the orgone energy. I love in brain science, they have, they'll talk about this neuron and they'll talk about this chemical, and then they'll say inductive forces do such and such. It's like, whoa. Inductive forces? Well, what's the inductive force? It's a bookkeeping device for the orgone because it's right there in front of their faces, but they either because of their own armoring or because the academic institutions don't want to hear about it. They don't go there. Yeah. A couple things. Let me say a couple things about the energy, because you showed Reich's vacuum tube. Did you by any chance have a picture of Jim's replication?
I don't.
Okay, so Jim replicated that, like he replicated pretty much all of Reich's work, not every bit of it, pretty much. Most of all the big things. and he replicated the Vacor tube. Okay, this tube, this is so fascinating. Okay, this is a vacuum tube, so there's not any matter in it, certainly not enough for an ionization effect, which is how they would explain this blue glow.
Right.
You can see there's a couple of electric wires on there. Reich put a very small electric charge through the tube after it had been soaked, so to speak, in the orgone accumulator for months. And a control tube will do nothing if you put the electric charge through it. But this, the orgone charged one, it initially glows a little bit of a reddish color, and then it goes into a full resolve of this gorgeous blue.
Yeah.
And then as you turn the energy down, the excitation down, it fades back to the sort of pinkish red and then goes away. Now this, to show the brilliance of how Reich made connections and then would set up experiments to test them, he said, oh, isn't that interesting? That kind of looks like dawn and dusk and then daylight. And long story short, came to conclude that light does not come from the sun, that light is a local phenomenon, that the energy field of the Earth, like people can see in the background on the screen here of this Earth shot, everybody looks at this atmosphere, but in fact, that's the energy field. And you saw in that orgone accumulator book, the astronaut with the blue energy field around his body. Yeah.
That is an unretouched photo, which NASA had real issues with when it was taken. It was originally released in an edited version, so and then
yeah,
we got the real deal.
What's all that blue stuff?
We can't explain it, so better get rid of it.
Right. So you have this stuff through the atmosphere, and the idea is that the sun, it doesn't put light on the Earth; it puts an excitation, electromagnetic or otherwise, and the local atmosphere illuminates into the blue. And at the low charge, it starts with that pinkish red of the dawn, goes into the full blue, and then shuts back down. Now, one of the things Jim always used to point out in many of his talks also was, they have this thing called light scattering to try to explain why the sky is blue and why water is blue. But what you find out from orgonomy is that there's much simpler explanations, that these are actually internal phenomenon, that this is the energy itself glows blue in its most basic state. And once you have that connection, just like you're connecting the pulsation phenomenon, all of a sudden you have the basis for what people call spirituality, right? Spirituality is really about our relationship to nature, or the divine is whatever you want to call it. It's our relationship to everything. And Reich, one of the things I love about him and why I joke that he doesn't allow any wiggle room, you can't be vague about your connection to nature. It's like, it's blue, it pulsates, it has spirals and spinning waves, it has a capacity for spontaneous excitation. These are like the details of this stuff that we talk about, but we always kind of keep it vague because we don't feel that happening in our own bodies. One more thing about the blue. Then you mentioned Reich's discovery of the bions. Okay, just think about this, folks. Okay, you can take any matter. You can take a piece of skin or some hair. You can take a dry leaf. You can take a piece of iron. You can take a piece of wood. You can take anything.
Yes.
And you can, one version of it, you heat it to incandescence till it glows red and just put it into water. And no matter what the matter is, it will break down into these blue pulsating things that Reich called bions. In other words, these are energy vesicles. Again, you have this blue atmosphere, water, everywhere. And that is the energy. Everything breaks down to energy. Now, Einstein famously talked about E equals mc squared, but it's kind of a mathematical construct, not really understood what it is. Well, here you can watch under a microscope yourself. Watch everything break down into energy. I mean, how friggin' profound is that? And a blue energy to boot,
You reminded me, one of the great perks of visiting you guys out at the laboratory is some of the parts of Oregon, such a beautiful state, that I was unfamiliar with. And one of those shining moments, and I know you remember it, was a trip we all made out to Crater Lake.
Yeah.
One of the most beautiful natural spots in America, a lake within a dormant volcano with a small volcanic island within the volcanic little mini ocean there. It's up 8,000 feet, the air is crystal clear and the atmosphere is absolutely sparkling. And I remember after I got back the photos that I originally took, this would have been more than 20 years ago, thinking I hadn't pushed this film at all, but the blue is almost unnatural. And just to give you an idea, this is the little island within the lake, but that's how it photographed. And I actually was completely at my limit of how many images that we have in the bin here that we can do at our max. But the other photos of the mountains up there really look retouched, because we're just not used to seeing that brilliant, uninhibited, natural blue. For most of us anyway, especially if we're, even remotely near an urban area.
Right. Like you said in that picture, it's not touched up. That you see it illuminating. That's not like fog. That's the illumination. It's being enhanced a little bit by the photo, but you can see that with your eyes too. And that's actually a phenomenon that James DeMeo objectively demonstrated with spectrographic experiments he did with distilled water as a control and distilled water that was charged in an orgone accumulator. It would have a spectrographic reading of fluorescence and in the ultraviolet, showing that there's a blue in there and it's coming out of the accumulator. Pretty amazing.
It is. I've just loaded one more photo taken from Crater Lake of one of the nearby mountains, and as soon as that little wheel stops spinning, we'll take a look at it. Once again. Whew.
So keep that up there for a second. I want to make point out something to everybody.
Please.
Okay, so nature, if you look at it, it's all blue. Now you see brown and green in that picture, but it's all blue. The sky is blue. The clouds, when they're more concentrated, like with thunderstorms, they start looking blue. We talk about the blue mountains because they're glowing blue. You got the water is blue. Now this is really cool. Another one of these cool insights of Reich's, just like the idea that light doesn't come from the sun, which again is not a concept. You can scientifically demonstrate these things. Okay, we see all this green. Green is a predominating color in nature. What happens when the things die in the winter? They turn yellow. Any artist knows, how do you make green? Well, you mix blue with yellow. So when the rain, which carries the orgone energy, gets back into the plant, it charges it up and it's green. Of course, it has a blue quality if you really look at it. And the soil too, when you look at that under the microscope, you see these blue bions. So for me, it's amazing. You look at a picture like this and everything is blue. We're looking at the orgone and yet we don't see it.
Yeah, that's perfectly stated. As children, many of us had the experience of looking up into the sky and seeing movement. Every little dot was spinning. And, you go to report it to a parent and they say, no, that's not happening. You can't be seeing it because there's nothing spinning in the sky. It's all still and blue. But you see it. You actually see the energetic movement. And it's something I encourage people to get in contact with. Lie on your back if you have an opportunity on a nice grassy area, look up at the sky, relax your eyes, and what you'll be seeing if you keep out of your own way is just that. There's another thing about Crater Lake that adds to the intensity of the experience, which is a certain amount of copper in the water adds to the blue color. A perfect example here. That doesn't look natural, at least, kind of Bahamian blue, but that's the way it is. And one more shot, about 8,000 feet up. Again, we're in a blue world here.
Yeah, totally. There's definitely a blue wash there. Yeah. Now, part of the reason I went and riffed on all that was I wanted to come back to Dr. DeMeo's replication of Reich's Vacor tube.
Yes.
He also kind of took it a step further. And he used also a vacuum tube, which he had special ordered and constructed. And did the same thing, had a control, and then had the one that was soaked in the, I'm using the term soaked, I mean, metaphorically, soaked in orgone, in the accumulator for months. And he was able to, you just stroke it with your hand. You don't even use an electrical input. And this is, I've done this many times with him. I would do demonstrations for him during workshops. So if you just hold this tube and you stroke your hand over lightly, you see this like white flash, just this very subtle thing. So what he did to objectify it was he did a time-lapse photograph. He kept the lens open for 20 minutes, and he just kept stroking and stroking and stroking, flash, flash, flash. And after 20 minutes, he developed it, and you got the blue glow. So once it was concentrated enough, you could. So there's this issue, just like he did with the water experiments. The water still looks clear, but spectrographically, you're getting a blue fluorescence, and readings in the ultraviolet. It's blue, even though you're not seeing it. There is a trace of blue in there. It's just once you concentrate it, then it becomes obvious.
Another thing that we haven't even mentioned is regarding the cloudbuster and weather modification. Jim became a very serious student of this aspect of Reich's work, and in fact got his BFA based on
the masters.
Yes, predicting and then making good on affecting the weather in Kansas for his degree at the University of Kansas. He once described to me a encounter, for lack of a better word, with a UFO, in that he, of course, was familiar with Reich's work and what happened in, I guess, October of '53, when Reich first trained a cloudbuster on something that did not belong in the sky, an obvious visitor, and saw it wobble or blink out or move at each time. Jim not only built cloudbusters, he was probably involved in more successful weather modification work, certainly than Reich himself, or as far as I know, anyone else. Working at times under contract with governments, Eritrea, Israel, Germany, things he was not allowed to talk about at the time, because although it worked and he helped to break droughts in those countries, the ridicule factor around Reich's work was strong enough that those who hired him did not want Reich's name associated with what had happened to stave off a serious drought or to affect weather conditions for the positive. And on the property, hadn't been used for some time at that point, but a very serious, well-made, trailer-mounted a cloudbuster here, and you see the basics. Industrial BX cable is just like the stuff that snakes its way through your walls, except it's a lot thicker. And again, the wires are pulled out, and the ends of the cable are dropped into a well or moving water or a lake, and it produces the effect we discussed earlier. Had you ever been involved with Jim while he was doing cloudbusting work there in Oregon, Tom?
Yes. A couple of things to say about this. When you're talking about how much work he was doing, one, you can definitely say as a fact, I mean, there's a lot of people doing a lot of scary stuff around the world, and I'll say something about that in a second. But the one thing you can say factually is he probably did the most serious scientific work. I mean, he would document everything, and he went very public with it and was always shunned by any authorities. And I should also say, because there were, like you said, this stuff becomes woo-woo and everybody gets fascinated by it, and a lot of people like to just try to play with it. You can use the analogy, except it's a small analogy, to X-rays. When they discovered X-rays, and people used to go into a shoe store and they got to stand on the X-ray machine and watch the bones in their foot, getting bathed in all this X-ray stuff because nobody knew the dangers. And I would say it's the same thing with the cloudbuster for anybody getting interested in this. that toward the last 10 or 15 years of Dr. DeMeo's life, he actually started, he didn't pull away from the work, but he started pulling away from being kind of too public about it because it was taking on too much of a mystique. And there's, we have evidence of, there are a lot of people doing a lot of this work, not necessarily
on their own
doing. So it is
no knowledge.
Yeah, it's a dangerous device. And, but there's legitimate science to do, atmospheric science, understand the atmosphere. So, even close-up pictures like this, I wouldn't even show people. Yes, his work has been published. It's easily found, and he constantly was going to the quote authorities and saying, "Look, you got this terrible drought in California. I'll come work it. Help fund me. We got this stuff in Arizona, this stuff in the Southeast," and it just, if any funding that ever came was just private, and you would do the work. And here's just one example. There's many. One example of how he was kind of not turning his back on it, but it's important to understand the evolution of this. So there was in California in the 90s, I think it was, they had what were called the Miracle March rains, where there was this terrible drought condition, and then all of a sudden everything turned around, and it was because of the work he was doing. And so he was real excited about that. He was so positive. It's like, my God, look at the hope that Reich's discoveries can provide humanity, underappreciating how sick humanity was, which is an ironic statement for the man who discovered the origins of armoring with the Sarah Razor book. It looks like a little bit of a contradiction, but he still really wanted to bring out the best in people, maybe naively to some degree.
Yes.
And so the Miracle March rains happen. He's all excited about that. And what do? All of a sudden, they were about to bring in all these regulations about water and being careful about it. And they said, "Oh, look, rain." And they threw all these restraints out the window. So he's like, it's just like the work in Eritrea, where you can see on Google Maps, these lakes were created in the Sahara.
Yes. And
then war broke out and the work stopped. And now over the last 20 years, you can look at Google Maps. I watch it every few years. They're evaporating. They're disappearing. And this kind of depressed is too strong of a word, but it would upset him. This gift that from Reich that I'm participating in, I'm putting my heart and soul into this.
Yes.
And armored humanity can not only not appreciate it, it's got to wreck it. It just has to wreck it.
Yeah.
So that's a little bit of context for all.
In a way, it's sort of an allegorical expression of Freud's death wish philosophy, that we are intent on destroying ourselves no matter what. Looking back earlier, and I only glossed over it, but of course, it's one of the most carefully put together databases in all of Reich's scientific work, the cloud busting that he did in Arizona. And before doing the work, he and his associates studied maps and meteorological histories of the United States to establish which area would be the most sensible to conduct experiments in, i.e., what area had experienced the least amount of rain in the most amount of time. The number one location was Death Valley, which was not where they were going to work unless they were interested in having death in the valley. And again, they leased a property of some acreage outside of Tucson. The humidity index, the amount of moisture that was increasing in the air as they conducted the experiments, bypassed anything that was recorded in the meteorological history of the area. And we are faced with what really can only be termed a battle, for lack of a better term, between the cloud busting and the appearance of UFOs, which seem to produce the byproduct of dropping the humidity index. But ultimately, he not only caused it to rain in an area that had experienced no rain in 5 years and a few inches in 50 years. Flooding happened. It snowed at the Tucson airport for the first and only time I'm aware of in history that Christmas. And the smaller things, which even reading the descriptions were thrilling to me when I first was exposed to the literature, a week or so before it began to rain, right in that immediate area where they were doing the cloud busting, they observed the distant mountains starting to show snow. And thinking about the area around physically, the two cloudbusters, it's sand, but it's dormant. But there are seeds in the sand that have been there for decades. And spontaneously, as the moisture in the air became so virulent in the best sense of the word, prairie grass started to sprout around the sites of both cloudbusters within days of them causing record-breaking rain. What happened with this ultimately is important. Local farmers were observing this closely. The newspapers were publishing about Reich's work. Ultimately, a local bank asked to meet with Reich and discuss creating a loan to set up some kind of permanent operation manned by trained locals. It was at that point, though, that the FDA's case against him warranted his return to the East Coast, and it all fell apart, in Arizona. But the results of the cloud busting were undeniable, even to the point that people in the area, a number of them had built homes in what had been runoff areas, but hadn't seen any water flow through them for half a century, and they were flooded out. It's a terribly exciting account to read, and it's all there in Contact with Space. And I should say, before you run out to find your copy of Contact with Space, only 500 copies of the book were ever printed. If you were fortunate and smart, you got one early when they were only $175 each. Oh, I wish. Many of us have nice first-generation Xeroxes, but it's an invaluable publication. And I wasn't joking before. It's probably the worst thing you could read to start with. It's the ultimate expression of more than 35 years of work that, taken on its own, is just breathtakingly uncomfortable to read. But when you see, again, like a gun sight, how deeply connected it is to every area of study that came before it, it makes marvelous sense, as all his work does.
It really does. So I want, because we'll be running out of time soon. I guess a couple of things I'd like to talk with you about.
All yours.
One is because you have a strong UFO UAP audience, and we're talking about orgone energy.
Yes.
Okay, so you have this energy continuum in space that Reich discovered and that DeMeo was confirming. And actually, that's the second book of his, for those who are interested in that angle on orgone energy and the energy continuum, that was called The Ether. James wrote a book called The Dynamic Ether of Cosmic Space. And the significance of this, and this is one of the reasons that OBRL sponsored that UFO conference with Danny Sheehan in Ashland. And it was one that also Sean Cahill and Chris Bledsoe and Colonel Carnell all spoke at too. And I wanted to start developing relationships with these people to introduce them to Reich's work, if they really hadn't heard about it. And had an opportunity to do that. And one of the reasons is, one of the things exciting for us in Orgonomy with this whole UFO disclosure thing, and for the new people here, just in 20 seconds, like Peter said in the introduction, the U.S. government is now acknowledging that these phenomena are real and have been. They've retrieved crash craft and even what they call biologics, the perished organisms. So they're admitting that's real. So by doing that, that's exciting to those of us in Orgonomy for two reasons. One related to armoring, which I'll come to, but the other related to the orgone energy, because you cannot make sense of the movement of these craft or these phenomena if you don't have some understanding of life energy functions. Now, I'm not going to say that can explain it all, but it's certainly ripe for honest research, because Newtonian mechanics is not going to make sense. So I wanted to put this information, particularly Jim's book, into their hands.
Yes, please.
Because if you think about it, this is the simplest connection I can make is, we have aircraft that fly on the air. Well, spacecraft, it suggests they're flying on space. They're flying on the orgone energy. They're catching the wave. They're catching the streams. And by working the physics of the orgone, you do these amazing things that you cannot do if you're just mechanically flying on air.
Yes.
So it's an exciting opportunity for the orgonomic community to maybe connect with some of these scientists, which I'm kind of slowly, trying to build those relationships. So there's that element to the UFO phenomenon. So, not only has UFOs been crazy people and orgone energy has been crazy people, now we're putting all the crazy people together.
We're going to be really dangerous then.
That's right. So this is very exciting.
You're absolutely on something I have found myself up against for decades.
And good for you for sticking in. Good for you for sticking with it.
Introducing the UFO-related work of Dr. Wilhelm Reich to an audience of professionals in ufology and students of it, because they're a perfect representation of a demographic of our population. And so within that field, it's Wilhelm Reich, didn't he go crazy? And again, to rebuild or to build from the ground up, a perception of the seriousness of his work leading up to, and his deductions, conclusions, and observations about UFOs and their implications for humanity that he made in the 1950s are now more germane, more relevant, and more important than ever. The fact that among the other luminaries that you've spoken about, Daniel Sheehan is now on board, so to say, with this understanding is a coup. He really is one of the most remarkable figures in the work. Chris Bledsoe's story is absolutely extraordinary. And
Chris's book.
Yep. Yeah.
The Ether book that I highly recommend.
Oh, there it is. Right. Very good. I also wanted to point out, I didn't load up all the titles, but this is one of a handful of books about Reich that is must reading for anybody interested in his life and work. Again, most of the books.
And I have a very thorough review of that on Amazon for anybody who wants that I referenced earlier.
Good.
This is a great overview of Reich.
Again, as far as a piece of research goes, doing the work, publishing, I think Jim was so ahead of his time in publishing Sahara Asia. It's one of the most important nonfiction books I think I've ever read in my life. And there's an outstanding review from me on Amazon for this wonderful book. But in it, Jim takes a number of established disciplines and areas of study and layers them on each other so that you can see superimposed on one body of data and another seemingly unrelated body of data extraordinary commonalities that establish, well, as it says, the origin of child abuse, sexual repression, war, and social violence in the deserts of the old world. It's a breathtakingly well-written book. It's extremely disciplined. It's beautifully laid out. I mean, this is a gorgeous example of the bookmaker's art, so to say, but nothing is wasted. The idea that as the atmosphere began to dry up, so did the human condition and the psychology, and along with it, the growth of paternalism, the destruction of the goddess, the destruction of women and children soon after on a certain level. And it's a book that will remain a scholarly curiosity, unfortunately, rather than seeing mass marketing and millions of people reading it, although it's the kind of book everybody should read.
Yeah, well, that's kind of my responsibility now that he's gone.
Glad to heap a little extra on you.
Yeah, no, it is a life-changing book, and what of the many things to talk about with it, which we were limited, is that if you want to make sense of history, okay, I remember I had problems with, well, what nowadays what they call a cultural, cultural relativism. It's like you can't criticize a culture. It's, so what if they chopped hearts out of children? I mean, that's just what they did. It disturbs us, but it's what they did. It's like something's wrong here. Well, this book helps understand by applying Reich's discovery of armoring that there is, as Reich clarified, primary and secondary emotions. And in that secondary realm of armored behavior, this sadistic sickness and madness comes out. Yeah. And this book brings that in. That's the missing piece in understanding history. All of a sudden, nobody's been able to make a distinction between emotional health and illness. That's the missing piece in understanding history, archaeology, anthropology. Like you said, it's this cross-disciplinary thing. He clarifies all that, and it's like a laser. When you understand life energy and armoring, all of a sudden you have a way to organize, without imposing it on. It's there in the data, organizing the patterns, and you find that there is a distribution around the earth of violence. If we were all born bad, it should be evenly distributed. Well, his discovery, because he's a geographer, they make maps, a prominent guy, a real discipline, and then put ergonomy on top of that knowledge. He laid this stuff out, and he shows that, in fact, violence, sadistic human violence, does have an origin. And it's in that area that you see in the cover there, where all the orange is, all the sand is. It's called Saharasia. 6,000 years ago, that was grasslands. That was not a desert. And for whatever reason that it became a desert, it was fast enough that it destroyed human beings' lives and peaceful cultures. Yes. And you got that whole, what later came to be known as the authoritarian patriarchal society, that became conquest and expansionist oriented. Anyway, it gives the great details. It's a horrifying but enlightening book to read. Like I said, it makes history make sense. It'll break your heart when it brings home the sickness of humanity, but it puts it in a context of hope, because once you understand the conditions that produce the madness, you can work against those and work toward enhancing the conditions which produce what we all know at their core is what real health, emotional health is, that it is pro-sexual, in an appropriate way. It's pro-woman, it's pro-child, it's anti-violence spontaneously. You don't have to make it that way. That is our core nature. And this discovery proves that.
It's also obvious when one really looks into it. Yeah. But to enter this area of study is like the after effects of having had a UFO sighting, or questioning everything around you and the nature of everything you thought to be real and true. Again, as a non-scientific person, grasping that we live in a sea of energy, and certainly Wilhelm Reich was not the only man of science or woman of science who wrote this phenomena, and that the ever popular and beloved Albert Einstein's idea that everything between you and I is just dead. We're energetic beings informed by life, and Wilhelm Reich had the most elegantly concise and short definition of life that I have ever encountered, quote unquote, pulsation within a membrane. We like to think of ourselves as a bit more than that.
Right.
But it starts there. And if that ain't happening, you ain't happening. I think one of the most poignant aspects of everything we're talking about here is once you have some sense of the sweep of Reich's discoveries and are able to examine them, demystify them for yourself, and incorporate them into your way of seeing the world, so much makes sense that didn't make sense before. Unfortunately, it's almost all tragic,
Right.
but it makes sense.
Right.
Imagine a world of people who loved each other, who were sexually healthy, and who actually cared about what happens to this marvelous speck of dust shooting through the cosmos at 30,000 miles an hour, that we care about what's going to be its fate when we're gone. I think in a way, the world is divided into two types of people: those who feel that way and are connected enough to life in a positive way and to the earth that we want to do what we can to at least not damage it any more than it is, or leave it in our own small way a better place than we found it, as opposed to the main swing of the world at the moment, which is, I got mine, good luck getting yours.
Right.
I'm going to be dead before anything terrible happens to the earth. So, I love my kids and my grandkids, but, I'm having a good earning year right now, and I want to keep doing it.
That's right. So,
if we can't joke about this stuff, we're lost.
No, for sure, definitely. And James DeMeo loved. We had our definitely jokey moments mixed in with the depths of whatever. So on that happier note, I want to say take a couple minutes to tell your audience about the Oregon Biophysical Research Lab, the OBRL, under my new directorship and leadership. So first of all, as people can see just by looking at the two of us, we kind of represent the worldwide orgonomy community, of which there's really maybe a couple hundred, a few hundred. And the vast majority of us are old or dead or dying. So one of the major goals, and this is what I offered to James DeMeo basically on his deathbed, because he was like, my responsibility was to protect his archives, make them available to scholars eventually, and to keep his books in print. And he was okay with the lab just evaporating because it was there for his research. But I said, well, how about if I just bring a small version of it east, which I'll be doing, and I'm in the process, taking a long time, move it east and kind of make the goal to bring more of this information out in the hopes of finding the young people that aren't there yet.
Yes.
What's that newer generation, even if it's just a handful of people. So that's kind of like a center goal. And part of the way I want to go about that in terms of information, you just gave a good demonstration of how vast this information is of Reich's, and we only kind of touched on Jim DeMeo's contributions too. You have this vast amount of energy of information. I want to spearhead 2 points. I'm going to carry it all forward, but 2 points in particular. The one is the orgone energy, to help people understand their relationship to themselves, to each other, and to nature.
Yes.
Via this energy, and do everything I can in workshops and conferences and Zoom meetings and presentations to help people make better core contact, what Reich called core contact with this energy, because that's where the hope is. The more you feel that, the more you feel your sense of freedom, the more you feel your sense of being able to act on what truly makes you happy in life, the better things are going to be. So there's the orgone energy, and then the other thing, if there's a life-changing bit of information, it's an understanding of armoring, the wrench in the machinery of humanity.
Yes.
So it's known, it's understood, it can be worked with clinically. I want to highlight that more and bring it into different venues, whether it's education, medicine, psychology, atmospheric science, cosmic science, whatever, and try to bring more attention to the people who are kind of getting close to that already, but don't know about Reich, to start building these, make these liaisons with people. So armoring and orgone energy and recruiting some of the young is a lot of what the OBRL is all about. You go to, or you might as well mention the website is orgonelab.org.
That's just what I was about to ask you.
Yeah, that's I'm going to use that basically as an archive right now. I'm only going to be adding a few things, and I'm going to have to start our own website. It's also HTML, which is, I don't even know how to use that, but Jim did. Anyway, you have orgonelab.org. I should also mention parenthetically our two of our vice presidents, Ira Bauer and David Parker, who's famous for his book on, I'm sorry, David, I'm forgetting the name of your book. What if everything you thought you knew about disease was wrong? Something to that effect. What really causes illness? Yeah. It's like a worldwide bestseller. Anyway, they're both VPs of mine, and they have a website called conversationsofnote.org, where it's in its nascent stages, but they're starting to post videos, do interviews with thinkers that aren't necessarily ergonomically oriented, but touch on it or lean on it. And that's part of my strategy too, is I have a lot of contacts of amazing people who aren't in ergonomy, but their work touches on it.
Yes.
And I want to connect with them and their audiences, again, to find these younger people for the future. So
you and I plan on doing a follow-up show later this year, perhaps involving some of these folks who are newer students of the subject, or some of our friends and colleagues that we met with a few weeks ago in our Zoom meeting, and continue this dialogue, because it's too important to just leave for an episode of one show.
Yes, yes, I agree. And in fact, I'll just announce here, I still have to post a whole thing on the mission and goals of OBRL and some of the projects that I'm working on, which I just haven't had time to put together yet. One of the things is in that you're referencing a memorial Zoom meeting that we did privately for James DeMeo. One of the things that came out in that meeting was we kept getting off the memorial theme, and at first it was like, oh my God, this is a terrible memorial. But in fact, what it showed me was that group of people, there's like 30 people there, 40, that they need a platform to discuss and examine this stuff. So I want to provide that. And what you're talking about is completely consistent with that. Les, please, let's do that as another outlet. You're reaching your audience of amazing people.
Absolutely. And as things develop at your end, I'll be happy to promote them here. Otherwise, I have to say, we are out of time, and it has been a true pleasure. A giant hug to you, my friend. Thank you so much for all you have done and all you do to advance this important work. This is Peter Robbins. My guest tonight has been Tom DiFerdinando, and the show is Meanwhile Here on Earth. Stay well, fight for what you believe in, and see you next week.
Thank you, Peter.